try this out. So, now, does that help? It does help. That's good. So that means I'm going to make all of you use mic. Okay. So, welcome to the. Yeah, I was going to say, or at least turn it. How's that? Great. Yeah, it's better. So anyway, okay, so this is the 9th week of our 10-week summer seminar series this summer, and doing something a little different this year. I think now everybody here has been to at least one. I think we saw some new faces last week, but you all have been to all of them. Dan's been to a few, so we're good. So each week we've been addressing a different topic, different area in which HFF works. And so this week we're addressing climate change and adaptation to that change. We have one more in the series, and it will be back at the campus in Ashton next Wednesday, 3 o'clock. That'll be the last one for the summer. So no more up here at Island Park. Come to Ashton next week. So today we have 3 speakers, and I guess I'll introduce each of them individually, and each will take maybe 15 minutes, talk about a few things, and then we'll have time for questions. We've been going until about 4:15. People have been engaged enough talking to the speakers, asking questions. We can certainly do that. If you need to leave at 4, that's fine too. So our first speaker today is Dr. Robert Al-Chokhachy. He's a research fisheries ecologist at the Northern Rockies Science Center in Bozeman. That's a U.S. Geological Survey research lab, and Robert has a broad portfolio of things that he works on. Robert did his PhD at Utah State, and I believe Phaedra Moody was his advisor, which sort of makes Robert and Jack academic siblings, I guess. They have the same academic mother, Phaedra Moody, and so, so we'll claim that relationship to Robert. Robert and I have worked on various things for quite a while now, I don't know, 10, 15 years or something, on native fish and various things. So anyway, I'm going to just let Robert talk about climate change as he sees it. He kind of works at a larger scale than we do, but kind of the whole Yellowstone region. So how that clicker, I think, works the normal way.
Sorry, I'm a bit hoarse. We've had quite a bit of smoke and refused to stop biking and stuff like that, so it works in your throat eventually. We're going to talk about climate change in the GUIA and some implications for ecosystems and fishes. If you have questions, you want to stop me in the middle, sounds awesome. And I don't have a lot of slides with tons of graphs. I do have some graphs. I'll explain them. If you want me to explain them more, ask. Some of the stuff it's averaged, and I can send you papers or new papers on anything I have here. So, but it's hard to give too much in too short time. So I think most of you here for a couple of reasons. One, either fish are important to you for one reason or another. Right? I don't fish much anymore personally, but I get to handle thousands of fish every year, so I really love being on rivers. But I grew up Atlantic salmon fishing in the Northeast, so I was fortunate enough to do that. But I presume a lot of people here enjoy fishing quite a bit. We also know that fish have an important ecological value in the GUIA. That's what makes the GUIA so important, right? So special, is that fish are just not important to us, right? They known to be used by upwards of 40 taxa use trout in their diets to some level. I think one of the most, I almost said funnest, but it's not a word. A really fun study was in 2015 by Arthur Middleton that kind of showed how when cutthroat trout declines in Clear Creek as a function of lake trout in Yellowstone Lake, they saw a shift in grizzly bear activity to predation on elk calves. So it kind of speaks to the value of Yellowstone cutthroat trout in our region or other fishes, but in this it's pretty interesting to see how animals react. And again, to me this also speaks to the value of the place we live, which is pretty awesome. Fish have an enormous economic value. We recently completed a paper with a person who's a postdoc with us, Tim Klein, and in Montana alone, $1 billion a year angler-related dollars. So pretty big industry. It dominates Montana, just like this region, but lots of the regions in the west. Scenes like this or this year are quite common on some of our famous rivers. And it's only increasing. In this paper, he looked at angling fishing pressure. So here, number of people fishing per day, and it's from 85 to 20, I think really at data like 2020 or something like that. And in yellow is non-resident anglers, and green is resident anglers. In the past 40 years or so, 40 years, there's been basically a doubling in the number of people fishing on Montana waters. Some of this we attribute to, of course, river runs through it. But certainly, right, there's a lot of people coming here. I just drove through West. It's interesting to drive through. But a lot of people come here. It's a nice place, and it's not just ours, right? And the majority of this increase is from non-residents. So it's a big influx of economics for people who rely on this industry. But there's a concern for this group of fishes that we all love, and this thing called climate change. We wrote a paper, this is from a big group of people like 6 or 7 years ago, looking at what is driving the conservation and declines of some native trout in the West, but it also relates to wild trout, whatever taxa you're interested in, is that it's getting warmer. And so the question is, how is this going to affect populations or species that we're interested in? So I'm going to talk about 3 things: warming climate, why it's important, some trends in available water, and then some findings from the field. I do a ton of field research. We do data analyses, but we do a ton of field research, handling individual fish, really to target climate change. So I've spent the last 15 years really trying to collect data just on trying to answer climate questions. And we see pictures or images like this, warming climate. This is from NOAA, where you have time. This is a long time ago, 1880 to now, and this is different from average. So what this plot's generally showing that here, this is the average 100-year average temperature, right? Every year is the annual average temperature. What we can see in the periods prior to about 1950, there were a lot of years that were colder than this average. But when we're looking in the more recent, say 40 years or so, most of these years that we're experiencing right now are well above that average. Oh, it's only a degree. That's a pretty big deal globally from a global perspective. And it doesn't appear, I mean, if you want to just do why it's what's causing climate change, that's awesome. I don't really, that's not really important to me right now. But at the same time, it's hard to deny that this is increasing, right? It doesn't appear like it's decreasing. So it's getting warmer and warmer. There's no way around it. But globally, you know, everyone's like, oh, what does that mean for me? So we've done some regional papers, analyses looking at trends in air temperature. So these are all existing snowtail stations across the GYA. Each one of the points in each one of these box plots, but don't worry about that. We have time from 1945 till 2015. That's the time period here. And then I have 3 plots: winter temperatures, March temperatures, and summer temperatures. And the red is the maximum, and the blue is the minimum. From this, the take home from this analysis was twofold. One, temperatures are warming. Both the minimum and the maximum are warming, right? Through time, this blue is increasing, this red is increasing. So not only are our summers getting warmer, but our colds are getting warmer as well, which is not that fun to think about. I love skiing too. I'm sure some of you do. But the other thing is that some of the greatest warming we're seeing from this analysis was occurring in the spring. So we're seeing a big influx of warming in the spring, which is troubling because that affects kind of some of our late season snowpack. And how does that start to influence what's going on for our streams, et cetera. So you step it one step closer, or bring it one step closer, and I just pulled some data from Ashton, right, from July. This is average July air temperatures in Ashton from 1970. That was all that was available till now. And again, we're seeing this increasing pattern in air temperature. Things are getting warmer even over a much shorter time span. We're talking in the last 50 years, we've seen quite a big increase in temperature. And you can break it down and say, well, if you didn't like the trend, that's cool. In the last, since 2000, we've seen, you've seen, if you live in Ashton, 7 years that are over 70 degrees average July temperature. That was never seen in the 30 years before that. Conversely, and I love the Olympics so much, I'm not a fan, I love the Olympics so much. Conversely, if you look at the last 20 years, there's been no years that air temperatures are below 64 degrees, where in the past 30 years, almost a third or half, I say upwards of half of the years were below that temperature threshold. So things are getting warmer locally, regionally, and globally. Right? So I know we don't want it in our backyard, but it's here. Why do we care for fish? In the simplest thing, air temperature, warm air temperatures mean warm stream temperatures. No way around it. Right? It's part of the equation. Air temperatures get warm, stream temperatures get warm. We like this group of fishes, salmonids, that have relatively narrow thermal regimes where they require cold water. So, nice picture of Yellowstone feather trout. And they're ectotherms, right? The water temperature affects their metabolic rate. So just like when you, I don't know, high school classes or, like lizards or ectotherms, fish, the outside environment affects their metabolic rate, such that we have cold temperatures, fish have really low metabolic rate and typically slow growth. That's why we go to really high elevation streams. 6 or 7 year old cutthroat trout are about this size, right? Conversely, when we at higher temperatures, fish have really high metabolic rate, meaning they need more oxygen and often they need more food to sustain those metabolic demands. Does that make sense? This is exactly why, and no one likes this. We just got an email from IDF&G on hoot owls. We have this analysis of hoot owls in Montana, and IDF&G just sent an email to our group. It's pretty fun. It's cool. Everybody has their own views. Like, I'm not a manager, so it makes it easy for me. But this is exactly why there are hoot owls in Montana. Exactly why. And I was just out swimming the other day in Three Forks and watched somebody catch a rainbow. They released it. It's right below the closures. Dead. It was so warm, it was crazy. Fish were just feeding voraciously, trying to persist. These guys were just, I don't even know what they're fishing for, catfish. I mean, it's right at the start of Missouri. It was interesting to watch, but it is why we have these closures in the idea of protecting some of our resources, right? And part of this is driven by this relationship I just described in words or cartoons, where you have things like growth rate up here, temperature here. Fish growth increases to a point, but then it starts to decrease. It's just too warm. Metabolically, it costs too much energy to grow, right? That's why these go on. These are contentious, obviously, for lots of reasons, but people make a living. I don't make a living off angling, so if I made a living off angling, I might have a different perspective on that. But it is why this goes on. And we did a review recently. This is one of the few states that actually does this. There are some states in the east that close some river mouths that they know are important congregations of perch trout where it's cold water, but Montana is one of the only ones where a lot of states like California, they rely on residents to do the right thing. I think we all know each other. We don't often do the right thing, right? At least, I don't know. So the other thing, what about trends in available water? It's not just about temperature. Those temperature changes, especially the warming in the spring, is having a really big impact on our snowpacks. So this is a pretty famous paper. This group has done multiple papers on trends in snowpack. So how much snow do we have April 1st? So what's the water in our snow April 1st? And each of these circles is a location, a snow-tell site across the west. Red means less snow, blue means more snow. And you don't have to, I mean, you can take your glasses off. If you take your glasses off, you can still see there isn't much blue up there, right? Most of the snow-tell sites we see in April, on April 1, are declining. We don't have much snow. I was gonna pull in, I'm trying to not have too many graphs, but just look up the snow-tell sites around here, look at April 1, look at May 1. We're losing snow, and it's because of warming. There's no way around it. So the amount of snow is impacting how much water we're having in terms of some of our streams. We followed this up with an analysis like, I don't know, 10 years ago, looking at trends in how much stream flow we have at all the gauges in the greater Yellowstone. Here's Yellowstone right here. We're somewhere around here, right? I live up here in Montana. There's the Yellowstone Lake. And each of these dots represents a gauge that's not impacted by a dam. So we looked at trends in stream flow. I'm just showing the results from 1970 to 2015. We did look back further and further. But almost every gauge is showing a declining trend in the minimum flows during the summer. So we're having less water in our streams in the summer, right? So it's warming, less snow, it's kind of a bummer. And we're having less water that's available to our fishes. And so what does this mean? I mean, from the simplest perspective, there's less available habitat for fish. There's just only so many places you can go. This is Pacific Creek. It's a pretty warm year, low snow year. We're there doing some surveys. And it's amazing how low some of our rivers get. And so now we have, imagine you have 100 fish, and typically there's 100 CFS in a stream. If you're at 50 CFS, now those 100 fish have to battle for opportunistic feeding spots, battle for drift, everything like that, right? Compete for resources. And so what this means is we're going to see and continue to see changes in how many fish streams can handle during some of these low flow periods. And it's pretty apparent. I'll show some of that in a second. And when we look at some of the futures, it doesn't get, I guess, more promising. If you looked at the kind of the state of the climate in the Greater Yellowstone, the climate assessment by Steve Hostetler and Kathy Whitlock, one of the things that came out of this was, what are the changes in the snowpack in the future? And so we just ignore this down here for a second. Each one of these, you can see the GYA is kind of shown by this, I don't know, weird shape. We call it something, I don't know what it'd be. And different time periods, 2021 to 2040, 2040 to 60, etc. This is 1986 to 2005. This is their like base period or baseline period. And blue is snow dominated, darker blue, and green is more rain dominated or 100% rain dominated. And again, as you move forward, we're getting closer and closer to more periods where we're going to see more rain and less snow in the greater Yellowstone. So how is this going to impact our streams and our rivers? But these are just trends through time. Again, it's snow, mix, etc. So the future doesn't look necessarily promising. I think some people are pretty excited by higher precipitation estimates in some of these, perhaps. But in a lot of our warmer streams or warmer locations, evapotranspiration, warmer temperatures are just going to offset all that warming. So I wouldn't hang your hat too much on some of that. I think there are better solutions to think about and adaptation measures we can work on than that. And I'll just report some findings from what we've been doing. Again, should we be concerned? We're just going to show results from a couple studies. And I've been looking at this question of, well, what are the effects of warming and low flows on trout? A lot of my research is with Yellowstone cutthroat trout, but we have one stream where we have brown trout as well. Pretty small streams. These are not big rivers, but it allows us to capture and recapture lots of fish. And we use everything from mark recapture, where we're marking fish with individual tags, to setting up experiments where we can divert water. So the first one, we set up an experiment, a PhD student working with me, a woman at Montana State, where we set up a bunch of individual sites, and we literally just diverted water to imitate a drought. This is 2 summers ago. We tried to do it 3 summers ago, and it was already a drought. It was like, wow, there's gonna be water left in 2021. And so we were trying to understand what are the different impacts on Yellowstone cutthroat trout, but also brown trout, right? Both of these are important native fish, but also economically important fish in Montana. The cool thing about the experiments is we don't have to worry about temperature. We're just focusing just on one attribute. In this case, it was discharge. We're gonna follow this up with some changes in productivity with Tim Klein, and so we're trying to figure out how to do it. It's not a private ranch, it's got tons of fish. It's a pretty nice place to live. And so from this experiment, this is kind of the short-term effects on drought or low flows. One of the most promising thing we found from this experiment was the lowest effect was on Yellowstone cutthroat trout, with when they were by themselves, the declines in growth were actually quite trivial. This is a pretty big contrast to brown trout, which showed a really big decline in growth, suggesting that water, for some reason, impacts brown trout, perhaps less efficient or not, or maybe not evolutionarily. They never grew up with big droughts. It seems surprising because they're from Spain, areas like that, but you never know what strains we have. But then when we have Yellowstone cutthroat trout cohabitating with brown trout, we see pretty similar declines in growth, suggesting that competitive interactions between brown trout are kind of reducing the ability of cutthroat trout to handle some of these trouts. Why would that be? Two reasons. One, stream flow is a pretty big driver of drift. This relationship was from a student, I don't know, this is published late, it was like 10 years ago. We looked at this across a number of streams, looking at in small streams, how does stream flow affect macroinvertebrate drift by putting out drift nets across a range of discharges, and a pretty strong relationship. We know drift, you guys know trout are drift feeders, and so there's two things that are gone. There's less bugs coming at you, and then at the same time, there's less habitat to secure those places where you have that shear between no flow and some flow coming at you. So you have more fish competing for these good spots, but there's less bugs coming out there. So it makes sense. But more to follow up on this. Again, this whole next stage of this is going to really focus on this, and it's super exciting, the stuff you guys are doing with macroinvertebrates. I was looking at it again last night. It's very cool. At some point down the future, in the future, we should be able to bring some stuff together. So I just also want to talk about some longer term, again, I only have 15 minutes, I'm sure I'm almost there, longer term impacts. This is about a 15-year study where, again, we mark fish twice a year in really small streams. I work in 5 streams, and we've been doing this twice a year for, I think this is my 14th year doing it. So one of the longer term impacts we've been looking at, again, is warming temperatures. This is looking like empirical temperatures, so how do warm years affect things like survival relative to colder years. And results are, that we found so far, and this is, we just submitted this in a paper with that PhD student, we're seeing slightly lower survival with brown trout with temperatures. In general, temperatures aren't doing too much to brown trout. Not too surprising. They can handle warmer temperatures than cutthroat trout can. We see some reduced temperature, reduced survival for cutthroat relative to brown trout for sure. Yellowstone cutthroat trout appear to be quite sensitive to this temperature threshold or temperature regime that's warming. And this is even more pronounced when they're with brown trout. Again, that competitive interactions with brown trout appears to be pushing our cutthroat trout into perhaps areas that are not that energetically favorable. We're completing an NREI model paper right now looking at that for the experiment and others on how brown trout, what is the actual mechanism? Are they putting them into, say, faster velocity habitats and those sort of things? Because then you can start to think about habitat restoration or other actions you could do to kind of offset this negative effect. And then finally, at the broadest sense, and we've just been looking at this more and more, and I was just out sampling last week. One of the biggest things we've seen is really the strongest effects across 5 streams is when we have the coincidence of warm temperatures and low flows, we're seeing really big declines in populations. For cutthroat trout, again, alone, this is from, again, 14 years, we see a 22% decrease in abundance. It's adult abundance from the 2020-2021 drought. So we actually see a 2-year lag in terms of the impacts on abundance of adults. We saw a slight decrease in cutthroat only, again, suggesting perhaps some resilience to some of the warming and drought. But both brown trout and cutthroat, when they're with brown trout, we saw an 80% decline in abundance. I mean, I'd go out and sample 8 sites and handle like 1,200 cutthroat, 1,200 fish. And we were just there last week, 200 fish. Like, it's just wiped them out. And so, again, I think part of it is this coincidence, and we're seeing, more of these type of years. This is from 2021, that are really hot, dry years. And I think these are going to be some of the most challenging for our fishes into the future, because they're predicted to be more frequent. just quick conclusion, we all like trout, I think, in freshwater ecosystems. The threats are likely to continue and to be probably worsened in the future, and so trying to think of opportunities to work on adapting to or mitigating some of the effects of climate change. And I know there's a big love of beaver and BDAs and those types of things. It is one possible option, and I have some students working on that in Nevada as well. I'm not against it, but there are quite a few opportunities to actually think about how we can kind of offset some of the effects of climate change, and thinking outside the box will be kind of fun. We are seeing both short-term and long-term effects on growth and survival. And so I also think I was excited to see, and we've talked about this with Rob, there are some other factors you all need to consider in terms of how much food is there, in addition to what I was discussing with Rob earlier in terms of things like dissolved oxygen. And there's some really neat work I know you guys are doing, but at Oregon State in terms of how fish are finding these areas to just make it work. In the Willamette, really warm system, and their coastal cutthroat trout are finding these areas that have just the right amount of oxygen, just the right amount of temperature to get through these kind of pinch points. And so I think we kind of dumb down animals a little bit and figure they're gonna just senesce and when it gets too warm, but they're pretty good at finding good locations to persist. And then finally, our strains on these resources, again, we all love these rivers. They are changing. This is the population in Gallatin County in Bozeman since 1970. If I put Bonneville County, Idaho on here, there's quite an increase as well. There's more people. There's just no way around it. This is going to amplify and continue to amplify until we start to think more about it. We're in the midst of loving something quite to death, but then when you add on these warming temperatures, lower amounts of water, increased anglers, more floaters, whatever you want in these rivers, I just hope we can actually stop and look a little to the future for these things to persist. We don't hunt elk when they're spawning, when they're having calves, right, reproducing, when it's a stressful time period, trying to think about opportunities to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. And some aren't going to be fun, but for other animals, we don't do it, right? We don't hunt during breeding season of elk. We don't hunt during calving season, and that's because it's a stressful time. We don't want to push elk around winter landscape. But for some reason, we feel like fish can get right through it. And so I think we almost need to step back and reframe it. That's my personal thing. But if you have any questions, again, all those slides, we have analyses, tons of papers. If you want to read them, I can send you whatever you would like. Rob has my email. If you'd like. So, that's all.
Great. Thanks, Robert. Thank you. That's outstanding introduction to the subject. I'll make some other comments later, but let's bring up Sarah Newcomb. She will be Dr. Sarah Newcomb, what, in 3 days officially defended?
Yeah, some margins to fix.
Yeah, I gotta fix margins on that dissertation. She defended her dissertation 2 weeks ago tomorrow, I think. I was there. She spent a year with HFF as a National Science Foundation intern, and will have her PhD from Idaho State University in geosciences. She's a hydrologist and will soon be working for U.S. Geological Survey at the Montana-Wyoming Water Science Center in Helena, starting in October, and doing some work with us while she's at it. So it's warmer and drier, and Sarah's going to talk about one of the mechanisms, or a mechanism in general, that how warmth and precipitation produce less stream flow, and then focus a little bit more in on the Snake River Basin and the Henry's Fork.
Thank you. All right, this is going to be a bit of a challenge for a hand talker, but hopefully all of the motions will still work out. Thank you all for having me here today, and thank you for setting me up really well, Robert. I'm going to be talking about a lot of the things that we just heard about. Hopefully we're all on the same page. Warming is happening. Warming in springs and summers is definitely happening, and we're going to be talking about kind of a little bit of a smaller scale, both in time and just physical location and geography, to see how this warming is actually impacting the water supply up in Henry's Fork, and more specifically in the upper Henry's Fork. And so I'll talk about what exactly I mean by the upper Henry's Fork in just a second, but that's kind of the general overview. All right, so I'm what you can classify as a mountain hydrologist. So I study how snow that falls in the mountains eventually makes its way down and becomes water in the streams. So all of the water that we rely on to fill reservoirs or fill the streams each spring comes from snow, well, not all, but the vast majority comes from snow that falls up high in the mountains. So these mountainous areas are our source water. Like Robert was mentioning, our annual snowpack is a really, really important store of water through the winter, and then when it melts each spring, a kind of big pulse is what fills our streams. And so I spend a lot of time thinking not just about the water that's in the snow in the mountains, not just the water that's in the rivers each summer, but actually what happens in between that controls how and when snowmelt becomes stream flow. So I'm going to start with asking a question: how much precipitation actually becomes stream flow in the Henry Fork? And so here I use the term precipitation to refer to any form of water that falls from the sky into the watershed, so it could be that rain, hail, snow. And one way that hydrologists kind of look at this or characterize how much water actually becomes stream flow is with something called the runoff ratio. And yes, I'm presenting an equation, but I promise this is important and will help us kind of build our understanding of the change that we are seeing. And so the runoff ratio is the total amount of water moving down a river for a given year, divided by the total amount of precipitation falling in the watershed for that same year. So you can also think of this as the amount of rain and snow that actually becomes stream flow. So a higher runoff ratio means that more water is becoming stream flow. A lower runoff ratio means less water is becoming stream flow. So if we look at the runoff ratio since 1989, so we're really going to be focusing on change from the late 80s onward for this presentation. We see that in the upper Henry's Fork, so I find that as the Henry's Fork above Ashton, we see that we have this pretty strong and actually significant decreasing trend. And this means that over the past 35 years, less water is actually becoming stream flow. You might have seen Rob and Christina and Jack show a graph showing that there's a lower water supply in the past 20 years in the Henry's Fork. Well, this is showing that that isn't just because of dry years. We're seeing a change in the system that less water coming in is actually making it to the stream. So there's some change going on besides just wet or dry years that's changing how water moves during this watershed. So one way to kind of look at this, or just pull out some numbers from this figure, in the late 90s, when we had multiple wet years in a row, we saw that as much as 60% of the water coming in was making it to the stream. More recently, in the early 2020s, we had several dry years, we saw that below 30% of the water coming in actually made it to the river. So, strong decreasing trend. This has pretty large implications for how we manage water resources, how we manage reservoirs, and how much water is in the river. So to understand what is causing this change, I first want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page about how snow actually becomes stream flow. So we're just going to walk through this very conceptual diagram so that we're all kind of using the same terms and understanding these processes. So this all starts when you have water actually enter the system, and here we're really concerned about the liquid water. So whether that's snow melt or rain, we have water that actually enters the ground and first goes to recharging soil moisture. And so this is water held in the soil. Some of that's going to become stream flow, some of that's going to go towards groundwater recharge. But a lot of it actually acts as kind of a source of water for forest water use. And so when I say forest water use, a lot of the water that actually enters the watershed is going to go towards this process called evapotranspiration, which Robert was just mentioning. And so evapotranspiration, or ET, is a combination of plant transpiration, so that's plants taking up water from the ground, returning it to the atmosphere, as well as evaporation, so water evaporating from soils, reservoirs, surface water, rivers, etc. And the breakdown of this is that plant transpiration accounts for about 75% of the total evapotranspiration, or ET. So plants moving the water makes up kind of this dominant movement of water back to the atmosphere. And I spent time talking about this because if we just think about how water moves through mountain systems, more than half of the total water coming in is going to go to evapotranspiration, even kind of at the baseline. In fact, like the global estimate is something like 60% of the water that falls on Earth's surface is going towards evapotranspiration. And this is important because it's that balance of inputs versus outputs for groundwater recharge and stream flow. And that groundwater recharge and stream flow is that water supply that we rely on, again, for filling reservoirs and filling rivers. And so as we're seeing less and less water becoming stream flow, that tells us that something in this process is changing. If we look at just change over the past 35 years, because again, we're kind of zooming in on this shorter period of record, because that's when we have the best data, we haven't actually seen widespread changes in how much water is entering the system. And I'll show a graph that has that data in a couple slides. But really what we're seeing is a change in how much is leaving the system. So to understand that, I just want to kind of provide some of the changes that are driving this change. So if we're interested in what affects those outputs, we first need to think about these different controls that kind of determine how much water can actually go towards evapotranspiration. The first is you need water that's actually available to either be evaporated or to be taken up by plants. The second, you need something driving evapotranspiration, and so that's really driven by hot, dry, windy conditions. So when it's really hot, dry, and windy, the air becomes kind of like this suction, and it just wants to suck water out of the soils, out of the trees, and return more water back to the atmosphere. And since transpiration accounts for the largest kind of bucket of evapotranspiration, it's important to consider what kind of vegetation you have in an area, how much land is covered by forests, things like that. So to understand why ET might be changing, we need to understand why these three variables are changing as well. So first, like I already mentioned, if we just look at available water, over the past 35 years, we actually haven't seen a significant change in water inputs. And so this is annual precipitation, so the total amount of water coming into the Upper Henry's Fork. If we plotted something like April 1st snow water equivalent or snow fraction, so how much of this is falling as snow, we're seeing slight declines, but it's not significant. However, if we start looking at what's driving evapotranspiration, if we look at our spring and summer temperatures, like Robert already mentioned, we see that there is this very strong warming trend. In fact, we see that since 1989, spring and summer temperatures have increased by about 1 degree Fahrenheit per decade, which is even faster than just the upper Snake River Basin kind of average. And so we're definitely seeing summer and spring warming. Finally, if we look at that third component, so what our vegetation cover looks like, this is a map that shows the trends in tree cover in the three major tributaries of the Henry's Fork, so the Upper Henry's Fork, Fall River, and Teton River. And this is again since 1989. And the way you interpret this map is that a more green color means that there's more dense tree cover, so we're having more trees in that area. More orange color means that we're seeing more sparse tree cover, or we've actually lost kind of forest cover in that area. The way that you kind of interpret this is you can just kind of pick up on colors. And so when you look at it, it's overwhelmingly green, at least in my perspective. Maybe green and red are not the best colors for this, but you see that there's this large patch of green, especially in the Upper Henry's Fork. And this shows us that forests are denser in, especially the Upper Henry's Fork, but actually in all three major tributaries to the Henry's Fork. And the reason why, and we can talk more about this if people are more interested, why we're seeing much denser forests is largely due to extensive disturbances from logging, wildfire, bark beetle die-off before kind of the start of this data record. So if we go back to what is changing, what might be driving a change in our water balance, well, we haven't seen a significant change to water that's being available to the plants. However, we have seen warmer springs and summers. And not only is this increasing the demand for evapotranspiration, but it's also resulting in longer growing seasons. As we're seeing warmer springs in particular, we're seeing that plants are starting to take up water earlier and earlier, kind of lengthens the amount of time that would increase evapotranspiration losses. And finally, for this last piece, we're seeing more forest cover and denser forests, so there's more trees to be moving that water. So when we put this all together, and again, we are working towards stream flow, we have to understand what's happening in the background. And we look at trends in evapotranspiration. Over the past 20 years, we've seen that annual evapotranspiration has increased across the Henry's Fork. And so again, you can see all three major tributaries. And this again shows the trend and the strength of the trend of evapotranspiration. Here, a darker green color means a more strong increasing trend, and I don't even really need to talk about brown because we don't have sea brown. And that's because, again, we're seeing this strong increase in annual evapotranspiration, seeing more water being returned to the atmosphere instead of going into the stream. And again, if you just want to pick up on colors and where you have the darkest green, it's really the strongest trend happening kind of in between Island Park and Big Springs, so kind of where we are right now. So, zooming back out, fish need water. We're in this room because we hear about fish, we hear about what's happening in the river. How does this actually affect how much snow and rain is becoming stream flow? Well, if we just look at this from a water balance perspective, if we consider historic conditions, which here is 30 years ago, so I'm sorry if that using historic to describe 30 years ago makes anyone feel targeted, I'm sorry. But if we think of past conditions, and we think about the water balance in the system, we had precipitation entering the system, and we had some evapotranspiration losses, but the difference between the two was pretty large, and so there was more water left over to go towards recharging groundwater or producing a stream flow. However, if you zoom forward 35 years to current conditions, we see that even though the same amount of water is coming in, there's more water leaving the system because there's more evapotranspiration. So the difference between those is much smaller, resulting in less water left over for stream flow and groundwater recharge. So the bottom line is that even with the same amount of precipitation, the warmer springs and summers that we are experiencing are reducing how much water is becoming stream flow. The system is changing because of this warming, just like what Robert alluded to. So what can we do about it? We're here, and we're going to hear a lot more about this in just a second from Christina. But as a mountain hydrologist, some of the things I think about is how can we provide the best predictions and information about the change that's happening so people like Christina can make management decisions and adapt to a changing water supply. So the first thing is changing conditions requires changing models. We need new metrics and predictive models that actually capture the change that's happening. This is some of the additional work that I did with Henry's Fork Foundation. I want to chat more about it. Unfortunately, I can't cover it in this presentation, but I'd be happy to tell you all about it. The second is starting to collect more data to monitor and model the change that we're seeing, especially in mountain areas. Mountainous areas are notoriously hard to get to and to study, which leaves a large gap in our understanding of the change that's happening in those systems. And then finally, this is a question that will inevitably come up because everyone else always wants to know, if you cut down all of the trees, will there be more water in the stream? Well, it turns out as it gets hotter and drier, we're actually more likely to see a decrease in the water supply in the stream when we cut down trees or do extensive forest management. However, there is more and more work coming out showing that certain forest management strategies, like thinning or creating canopy gaps, can improve or create larger snow accumulation periods. And so you can actually see more snow being held on the ground. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to investigate that, especially in the upper Henry's Fork. And that's my contact info. I think we're due questions at the end, but yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Sarah. So we'll, yes, hand it off to Dr. Christina Morrisett. She is our climate adaptation manager at the Henry's Fork Foundation. Also Utah State PhD, studied with Sarah Null, who Sarah Newcomb set this up well, works in highly regulated river systems. And so Christina, kind of like me, we work in regulated systems. We love dams and diversions and return flow and water rights administration. We geek out on that stuff. And it's like, well, what do we do with the lower amount of water that we have? So I'll just turn it over to Christina to talk about some things we might do to adapt to this new world.
Thanks, Rob. Stand over here. All right. Hi, everyone. This is a soft launch of our brand new climate adaptation program. So I don't think Brandon or Rob have seen me talk about this yet. It's kind of, we got money to, seed money to fund this program starting in January when I stepped into this position from the Murdoch Charitable Trust. Right?
Yes.
And part of my job this year is to figure out what is this program? What are we doing with this program? What are we aiming for? What are our ethos? What do we do? What do we not do? So this is the soft launch of that. So I really welcome your feedback on what you think about this, because this is definitely in progress. So I guess before we go into my presentation, I want to reflect on what the last two presentations kind of talked about. We really talked about trends that we're seeing, but when it comes to our experience on the river, our experience in a place, oftentimes we're experiencing that in kind of a year-to-year kind of experience. And so I'm going to show you the Henry's Fork within my lifetime, because I think that's how we experience these trends on a day-to-day, kind of personal year-to-year basis. So I was born in water year 1993, and this is what the temperature was like in water year 1993. So we have the darkest blues are kind of less than 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the darkest browns are more than 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but generally just blues, colder, browns, warmer. And so this is what it looked like in 1993. I did not live in Idaho, I did not live in the Henry's Fork, I did not know the Henry's Fork existed at that time. But Rob tells me that water year 1993 was the summer that was never summer. I came to Idaho in water year 2015. At the time, it was the driest year on record since the 1930s Dust Bowl era. This is water year 2024, where we are at currently. And I made this graph on Monday. So what are we seeing? One of the things we're seeing is something that Robert and Sarah both talked about, is shorter winters. These kind of shorter, cooler periods. And I kind of highlighted the winters of my lifetime in the Henry's Fork in this purple here. Shorter winters, as Sarah talked about, means a longer growing season. In our system, it can also mean earlier ice off on Island Park Reservoir, which can create water quality issues in our system. And it can also shift hatch timing. Thinking about the warmer side of things, right? Sarah talked about how in the upper Henry's Fork we're increasing in terms of temperatures by about 1 degree Fahrenheit per decade. Looking at a report that Rob put together today, at Island Park Dam specifically, we're increasing by 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. And right, Robert talked about how that impacts water temperatures, and so maximum summer water temperatures are warming about 0.2 Fahrenheit per decade. And Sarah alluded to this graph. I'm very proud of this graph. Jamie had it published in Fly Fishing Magazine, and so that was very exciting to see. It does show that average natural flow in the Henry's Fork watershed has decreased by 15% in the last 23 years compared to the 23 years before that. And we do, right, have a dam in the system that kind of helps us mitigate that low flow experience. Right, we have higher flows in the summer in our system. But I got a phone call yesterday by someone asking, what is going on in Island Park Reservoir? It's draining so fast. Outflow actually isn't any different than what's happened in past years. Outflow is just about average. Inflow is what's low. And so because we're not filling back in as fast as we're taking out, we're draining the reservoir faster. So what do we do about it? In my program, I'm kind of thinking about it in these 3 steps, these 3 kind of platforms. We analyze, we anticipate, and we adapt. And so we analyze the data that we have to get a sense of where we've been. We anticipate, and we're predicting and forecasting forward on the long term, on the short term scale. And we use that information to empower people to adapt accordingly. And we can adapt at different levels as well. We can adapt the ecosystem, we can adapt institutions, and we can adapt individually as recreators in the system. First, I'll talk about a way that we could adapt from an ecosystem perspective. And I'm going to talk about the adaptation tool that we talked about multiple times during this seminar this summer, and that's aquifer recharge. But I don't think we've actually shown you kind of like a diagram walkthrough of what that looks like. So here we have a river, and we have farmland. We take water out of the river to irrigate crops. And what happens to that water next? Some of that water evapotranspirates, some of that water percolates down into the deep aquifer, and some of that water returns to the river via surface or subsurface flows. And what we're really interested in at the Henry's Fork Foundation is these subsurface groundwater return flows. And it's because these return flows come in cooler, and we get more water at a very specific time of the season when we have lower flows, when we have warmer flows, and so having that cool water and more of it can be really impactful, both for fish, but also also on putting more water in the river for farms to use. But in our system, we've seen a conversion away from flood irrigation to sprinkler irrigation, or on Harriman State Park, no irrigation at all, which means that we're reducing how much water is going into the ground, so we're reducing how much water is returning back to the river in that lagged fashion. So something we're thinking about is how can aquifer recharge via flood irrigation help recover return flow? And we're thinking about that at multiple locations across the watershed. So one is in Harriman State Park. Harriman State Park used to be flood irrigated. And so something that Jack's working on as part of the DIRT plan is restoring flood irrigation to increase cold groundwater inputs to the river. That's beneficial for creating more kind of trout refuge, that cool water. And I put refuge for bugs, and I know that's incorrect, and I know Rob and Jack are both gonna give me a look about that, but I didn't have time to ask them for clarification today. But it does have a benefit for the diversity of bugs in the system. And so returning and restoring flood irrigation on the landscape where we get, put water on the ground, and within a certain amount of time, be it 2 weeks, be it 3 months, that water comes back in, and we can really harness the cool water that both trout and bugs need. We can also do the same thing in the lower watershed on agricultural land, where flood irrigation used to exist. And same benefit, right? It creates this cool water that's important for trout and for bugs. I think Rob and I have talked a lot about how gray drakes may really, we may have seen a shift in that in the lower watershed because of a move away from flood irrigation, because of the life history traits of those bugs. But also, and this is a little roundabout, when you take water out of the river, put it on the ground in this agricultural land in the lower watershed, we know it takes about 3 months to see that stream flow response come back into the river. So when we see that water, when we put water, when we have it on the ground, it's coming back into the river when we most need it in July. And so we can kind of use this underground temporary storage reservoir and have that water coming back into the system in July and August, and that actually takes pressure off of how much water we need to deliver out of Island Park Reservoir, allowing us to keep Island Park Reservoir fuller, which, as we all know, is great for winter flow, for trout, is great for water quality, and has a lot of benefits. And so it can actually reduce outflow from the reservoir. We can also adapt institutions, and here we can think about institutions as maybe like guides and outfitting and kind of that industry, and we can think about institutions maybe from a more regulatory perspective. So one adaptation approach is developing a regional fishing portfolio. There's work that came out, Chase Lamborn and Jordan Smith from Utah State, studying how outfitters and guides in West Yellowstone are adapting to climate change. And one of those things is developing a regional fishing portfolio. Like John McDaniel talked about last week, if you're fishing in one place all the time, it may not be good every day, right? And that's difficult and challenging when you have clients. But if you're able to fish in more places, maybe shift that fishing temporally, different times of the year, shift it at different locations, and really develop that fishing portfolio that can be really beneficial for guides and outfitters, trying to provide those quality experiences for their clients. Another adaptation approach is something that we talked about, I think, on one of our very first seminars this year, is Jan Brown mentioned climate refugees, and how folks maybe also, part of the reason folks might be coming to this area is seeking out kind of cooler temperatures in the summer. And Robert talked about how we're experiencing this increase in visitation. And so another adaptation approach there might be, we actually need to manage it. And that's something that Madison will talk about next week, is what can we do about managing visitation and use? Who is responsible for that? Who is not responsible for that? What can they do? What can they not do? But really leveraging kind of the regulatory perspective is also something that we can do. And then we also can adapt at the individual level. And so that might be changing behavior and changing attitudes. So something that I really enjoyed this winter was a podcast episode from Orbis with John Gurach, is that how you say his name? And it's literally titled Fly Fishing Through Climate Change. And he talks about what do we do as anglers when addressing climate change, and how do we still get the experiences that we're looking for despite this change? And something that he said in that podcast was, you can do what you can to fix it, be it that personally or politically, but you also gotta live your life. And then last week during seminar, John McDaniel said something to the effect of, maybe this is the new normal. And so, right, as an organization, we can do as best we can to change institutions, to address the ecosystem, but at a certain point, we have to make individual behavioral changes and attitude changes to do what's best for our individual experiences. And so, some of these voluntary measures that we can do is shifting fishing seasons. Maybe midsummer is no longer it. Maybe you need to come in the fall and fish. And considering when else is it good to come and fish the Henry's Fork. Diversifying the location that you're fishing and seeking out new fishing spots. Targeting more species. And being opportunistic and fishing closer to home. Which I know is very challenging when you're coming on the Henry's Fork. It's a vacation location, and you're very specific to, I only have this 1 week to fish here. And it's very challenging when you come here for that 1 week and that 1 week isn't great. And so come here longer, try and convince your boss to work remotely. And just kind of, and like also like fishing closer to home. And I think also I would say, and these were all things that were covered in the Orbis podcast, but also like doing a little bit of self-reflection and thinking about why am I fishing? What am I seeking when I go out on the river, and leaning into kind of like those aspects. Like, am I really seeking, do I just really want to catch a fish today? Okay, maybe you can go somewhere else to really catch that fish. Maybe you just like want that meditation of being in a beautiful place and what that feels like, and maybe you kind of need to like shift there. And so I think kind of looking internally at what am I trying to get out of this experience can also be something when it comes to individual adaptation. Other voluntary measures, and this comes out of a Lamborn and Smith paper, is anticipation and planning. So if you're actually, right, it's different, like we're used to, I'm just gonna go out on the river today and see what happens. But maybe it requires a little more planning now. We have so many tools to help you with that planning. HFF, we have so many web apps to help you plan your fishing day. On April 1st, Rob puts out his prediction for water supply and what that's gonna look like for the year. And we can create more tools and really adapt those to help folks anticipate and plan accordingly for what the fishing season is going to look like. And everything that I just talked about, right, are things that we can do as an organization. That's something that I need to figure out for my program. Like, how do I work with people to change behavior and attitude? What are things that feel good in the community? What are things that feel not good? That might sound ridiculous, and maybe are things that I should leave out of this presentation. And so those are still things that I'm figuring out. But right, this is kind of what I've boiled down this program to, is we're analyzing, we're anticipating, we're adapting accordingly, and we can adapt at multiple levels. And then I guess I do want to acknowledge that change is hard. I've been trying like, don't cry when you say this, but like, there's a lot of grief in climate change. Like, we love this place, and seeing it change in my lifetime, even being out here, that's hard, right? But climate adaptation is really about hope, and that's what we're trying to provide to you all, is hope for what for what this can be moving forward, and that's what I want to leave you all with. So thank you.
Thank you very much, all three of you. That was fantastic. Let's see, how about questions, discussion? Maybe you all three need to come up here or something, or we'll see what anybody thinks. If anybody has any observations, questions? And if you don't, I'm gonna say a bunch of stuff. Okay. So, one thing I will say is the research that Sarah presented, it was just published like 2 weeks ago or something. So that work, Robert, it's in hydrological processes. Newcomb, Van Kirk, and who else is on? Maggie Krapp is on there, and Sarah, another Sarah. Yeah. So anyway, that one is out there, and it has this all the nitty-gritty details of how Sarah figured out these trends and the runoff yield and all that kind of stuff. So that's there. Robert, I hope that the work that you all are doing that we've been talking about, the last few months on being able to anticipate trout populations 2 years hence. We do pretty well with that because most of these systems, it's recruitment limited, how many young trout can get into the population, or it's carrying capacity limited, and we usually see that reflected when fish enter sort of the fishable population at 2 and 3 years old. So we've been doing this at HFF for a long time because we know that it's winter flow driven. We know what winter flow is, and I can tell you 2 years from now we're gonna have a good year class or a 4-year class or so on. But I'm excited about, I'm hoping that we get to work with you all to do some compare and contrast because, the stream flow that you had in that one graph, you made a point of saying these are streams unregulated by dams. Then we work in these systems that are highly regulated by dams, and then Christina showed how water goes out of the river and then some of it comes back in. And so we have a system that's driven by natural flow coming in, by storage and release of water in reservoirs, by diversion, and then by return flow, and then in some cases that whole cycle starts all over again. And so I'm really fascinated. I'm hoping we can collaborate on when you bring the upper snake into the mix of watersheds, you're looking at what we can learn about regulated systems versus natural systems, and they're very, very different. And we're actually finding that, Christina said, there is some resilience provided by having large storage reservoirs. So our low flow period is not in the summer in much of our watershed, it's in the winter. So we have kind of the reverse effect. So I think the concepts are all the same, but in the regulated system we have this additional confounding, and a dry year becomes even drier for 2 reasons. Christina mentioned we had a call the other day. Somebody said, how come Island Park Reservoir is draining so quickly? And we looked at the numbers and was like, this is just average irrigation outflow. We had 1,600 CFS for, 12 days, 13 days, not even 2 weeks. We're back down to 900, so that's totally normal outflow. But what was inflow? It was like
16% below
yeah,
average.
82, 83% of average. So you've got average outflow, well below average inflow. What happens? Well, the reservoir drains faster. So that's a function not of increased irrigation demand, it's just a function of kind of normal irrigation delivery with much lower inflow. So now what's going to happen, we're going to get to the end of irrigation season with an empty reservoir and low inflow. So now we're paying for it twice. We're paying for it during the summer, and then we're going to pay for it in the winter. So the reservoir has a way of compounding the effect that you would see of climate change. A couple other observations, one of which Robert and I were talking about. This is one of these geeky ecological mathematical concepts, and Jack mentioned it if you were here a couple weeks ago, but a lot of these systems go along fine and you kind of gradually change, it gradually gets warmer, you don't really notice the difference, and all of a sudden you hit a threshold where something changes dramatically. And that's what Jack is learning about an Island Park Reservoir, where for decades, and this is where Tyler King, you know Tyler, right? You know another Utah State, right? USGS, right? So Holly has found that back in the 80s and 90s, Island Park Reservoir rarely became eutrophic. That's the state of having excessive productivity to the point where you deplete dissolved oxygen, right? And rarely did it happen, and then since 2000, it's happening more and more and more frequently, to the point where most years now we're sitting right on the edge of, are we gonna have decent water quality the rest of the summer, or are we gonna just flip over and have the poor water quality Christina mentioned all the rest of the summer? So we're trying to figure out how to avoid getting to that tipping point. Last thing that is really interesting, and this year, as far as I can tell, is a great example. Christina mentioned that managed aquifer recharge, as we would do it, say, down in the lower watershed, in the Rexburg area, for example. you put water on the ground in April, May, that's when we have that's when we have extra, right? Reservoir system is full or filling. Plants don't need that much, there's some extra water in the system, put it in the ground. It comes back in July when we need it. If enough of it comes into the river, that helps meet some of the irrigation demand, which takes the pressure off of the reservoir system. So earlier, you know, those of you who read the water report know I have this silly 600 CFS rule of thumb, right, that tells you about when you need Island Park reservoir draft. And earlier this summer, I was doing the math, and I was like, yeah, we have 1,600 cubic feet per second out of Island Park, and I said, but according to my rule of thumb, we should have 1,800. We're actually delivering 200 CFS less than we would be normally, and the difference is there's an additional 200 cubic feet per second in the system because a lot of managed aquifer recharge was done this spring. It's the only reason I can see, and it didn't really start to be reflected in the reach gains until late June, and we did it in March and April. And so this year I think is going to provide a real example of, yes, if we did, what was it, 50, 60, 80,000 acre feet of recharge in the lower Henry Store, we are actually seeing that, and the outflow from Island Park would have been even higher without that additional gain. So that's kind of proof that this really will work, and this is one adaptation strategy that, and it scales. You can do it, you know, Robert mentioned beaver dam analogs, it's a kind of that sort of flavor of thing. It can work in headwater catchments, it can work in Harriman State Park, we think, and it certainly works like on the scale of the entire Eastern Snake Plain aquifer. So, yeah, I think hopefully we have some message of hope, unless you're John McDaniel and you want the same experience that you had in 1983, which we're pretty sure, and even John seemed to be pretty sure, is just not possible. So anyway, unless anybody else has anything to say, Jack has something to say.
I just have a question for, well, I've been here.
Well, I know, same here. I'm just like, the whole time, I'm like, oh, I should write this stuff down.
For Robert, something that I hear a lot, and this kind of goes back to what Christina said about like fish for other species of fish. And in the trout angling world, oftentimes the first thing we think about when it comes to climate change and fish that might do better with warmer temperatures is brown trout. And to the point where there have been articles written about how we should stop doing native trout restoration and focus on brown trout instead. Your research seemed to potentially contradict that, and I guess I just wanted to hear your comment on that and maybe expand on why brown trout aren't doing so well with warmer, lower water.
Right. So, I'll step back. First, I think the idea that brown trout can handle it all is an overshoot. In Europe, brown trout aren't doing really well in a lot of places, right? And especially in the southern climates, southern Europe, they're in tiny streams. That's just the way it is in some of those bigger files. Spanish biologists, like, it's pretty clear they're seeing a climate signal. In Montana, we're seeing brown trout moving up in a lot of our streams. So into smaller and smaller streams, I think, to avoid that pinch between where temperature and low flows are a problem. And we see them in really, really small streams and really high gradient streams. Not surprising again when you think of Europe. In the paper by Donovan Bell, recently we did that paper with Donovan led, looked at trends in distribution of brown trout. And overall, there isn't this big increase. I think there's this idea that they are going to be our savior. But I'm not sure it's really the case. In Tim Klein's stuff with drought in Montana, it is crushing brown trout in the really big rivers. And the expectations, the biologists are setting themselves up for good. Because we should be having this many fish per mile and they're failing. It has nothing to do with anything they're doing, it's just, there's no recruitment. And so I think, I just don't think I think there are other fixes people could try and do to improve recruitment. A lot of our big rivers, we remove all the structure. So in terms of like winter habitat and things like that, or summer deep pools, they're gone because we pull all, drive the Galvin, the rafters on it, there's no wood in that stream. So like there are other things we could do. I think that could actually improve how fish can be more resilient to some of these changes in climate. I hope I answered your question.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
The other
it's
thing
very
is
helpful.
like,
Yeah.
that idea of portfolio, we did touch it out in Tim's paper, but there's some really cool ocean commercial fisheries papers, which are fun, you know, I don't know what type fun that is, but where commercial fisher people are basically changing, they have a boat that can only go so far, can only hold so much fuel, and so they're changing how they're fishing based on the same principles, which is really cool. And the final thing is, there's a cool paper from Asia by Koenig, it's not Martin Koenig, obviously, that they set up a reserve where you talked about like, hey, let's consider other things we can do. And they set up this reserve and they stopped commercial fishing in these big rivers, they're big rivers, but where fish is their livelihood. They're all commercial fisher people in these streams. They set up this area kind of like a marine reserve, and it actually increased the overall abundance, the amount of harvest they have overall. So thinking about how, to me, that's always interesting to think about how we think about these rivers. Should we take a break for a little while and just jump in with snorkel and mask? Right? And say, hey, we need fish. It's still fun to go out and get some really cool photos. And when you're at the bar, show photos instead of talking about it. Right? So, I don't know. That's my thoughts. All right.
Great, thanks.
We've been talking, and you've been talking in terms of science. You can manipulate reservoirs, you can manipulate plant growth, in-stream flow, evaporation, transportation. You guys can do that, but the main figure or the main group that you haven't changed is the main group you're dealing with, fishermen. We have to change, perhaps, the idea of what fishing is. Fishing may not be fishing with a hook, without a hook. That's your mention of we don't go into elk reproduction season. Why should we be doing the same thing on brown trout during the fall of the year? So the point is, we're going to have to come up with some kind of, not perhaps scientists, recreation people, and start coming up with ideas, okay, we could do this, and changing what we think is fishing. That's the way I see it.
I agree. I was at a talk recently with a park in Yellowstone National Park in the Lamar. They estimate fish are caught 7 or 8 times per year. So that's 7 or 8 times for a female trout that just spawned, spent all its energy is trying to get through, enough energy to get through the next winter. That's crazy to think of, right? It actually is. It's just shifting our thoughts on how we approach it. It's not fun, but it's not hard, it's a difference.
Well, and that's why the Henry's Fork Foundation has 2 2/10 or something staff devoted just to communicating with our constituency. And yes, you're right, Dad, that the anglers are the most difficult part of the equation, we think, anyway, because you're right, we can do all kinds of crazy stuff with Island Park Reservoir and managed recharge, and we can do all this stuff, but if people have a given expectation, and as Robert said, we're not meeting that because we set up an expectation of, oh, you gotta have 5 fish to fish to in the ranch in a day, and maybe we need to change that. So that's something I know Christina is spending a lot of time thinking about, and Jasper, Jamie, I think left, and yeah, we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we do that, what do we do, how do you push, where do you push, and the social science becomes really important, and yeah, that's more challenging really than the physical and the biological science. So thanks for the comment, you're absolutely right.
So, talking about just specific rivers, how there's focus on climate resiliency and headwater, a lot of wood, chaotic flow, and that water comes back down colder, and keeps the river colder throughout the summer. And hearing about how the aquifer recharge since pivot
Yeah.
irrigation and lining canals and that, how long have the pivots been out? And
Yeah, we had a massive increase in adoption of pivot irrigation between 1978 and 2000, but it's leveled off since 2000.
how do you feel the farmers in the region are amenable to moving back to an older style of irrigation?
Yeah, Rob and I talked about this a little bit today. So if you're aware of the groundwater surface water conflict happening in Idaho right now, I think groundwater users, since they're at risk of curtailment, they are interested in kind of where can we put money so we can ensure that we get water. And one way that they can do that possibly is to pay senior water rights holders to flood irrigate, to make up for the, labor costs, the financial costs, because flood irrigation doesn't provide as good of a yield, as good as crop quality. And so that's why it's not attractive, and that's why we moved away from it. But if you can make up for it and keep those farmers whole, then maybe we can do some kind of trade-off of paying each other to flood irrigate so other people can farm the way they want to farm.
Yeah, good question. And yeah, Christina has a couple of papers out, one on the actual conversion issue. That's where the data came from, on when farmers converted and what were the hydrologic consequences downstream. And then another one that that one.
I got proofs this morning.
Okay, that one just got accepted on the potential for managed recharge to offset some of the loss that we've had in changes in irrigation practices. So that stuff, yeah, that's brand new. It'll be out.
Can you make an example of managed recharge?
Sure.
Yeah.
So managed recharge is the intentional sending of water out to have it infiltrate down into the aquifer. And I don't know if you've been to Egan Lakes or the sand dunes outside of St. Anthony, but there is a managed aquifer recharge site there. And so in March and November, they're sending water out into those canals all the way out to the sand dunes and having it recharge there and come out. And we've been studying that site since the 80s in terms of what the stream flow response, how much water it takes, how long it takes to get that water back in the river.
It's pretty good. I mean, it's big to put it in perspective. I mean,
It's huge.
When they do that, it forms a pretty sizable lake out there, pretty much, and then it all sinks into the ground. That's my understanding. I mean, it's not like we're putting it in like a pipe,
No.
like a straw or something.
But in Teton Valley, the Friends of the Teton River, they are working with individual canals. And individual canals do have kind of, they have like an overflow site at the end of the canal, like if all the water hasn't been taken up, the water will flow into like a gravel pit. And so like those are smaller sites that they will put water into to do aquifer recharge that way. And those just have, and they can have different kind of like infiltration rates. And so I interned with them and worked on this for a little bit. And there's one site that's kind of closer to Teutonia off of like Southly Creek. And that doesn't have a lot of infiltration, and so it actually like fills up like a pond and then takes some time to infiltrate. But they have a site off of Darby Creek, which is like right at the base of the Tetons, and because of that geologic history, so I needed to study the infiltration rate to get a sense of how fast does this, and the farmer who was helping us was like, "You will never pool water here. It will just go straight into the ground." And we tried, and he was like, "I told you." Like, the water did not pool for us to be able to measure infiltration because it just went into the ground that fast.
That's interesting. I was over by Felt and coming in Badger Creek, completely empty.
Yeah, it's always.
But when you look down, right by where it comes into the Teton, it's
River,
completely full.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Well, it just goes down in the gravel and it reemerges. There's a shelf of relatively impermeable rhyolite, you know, volcanic rock underneath all that gravel. And when the water hits that rhyolite, it just comes back to the surface, because that rhyolite is much, much, much less permeable than the gravel sitting on top of it. Just to give you an idea of permeability, I know that may not mean anything, but I had graduate students a long time ago now actually measure loss rates out of stream channels and canals. And they'd measure here, and they'd go down a mile and measure again, and we'd count. And most of the gravel over in Teton Valley, and then most of our canals will leak or seep at a rate of 3 to 4 feet per day. It could rain 4 feet in a day. So think about 4 feet of rain. And that's why you never see a puddle, because that stuff can absorb 4 feet a day. There are other places where it's less so. Maybe it's an inch a day, half an inch, where you have more fine material. But we try to do recharge in these places where we get the 2 to 3 feet per day seepage that will absorb more water. But yeah, we have super high seepage rates, unbelievably high, especially in the Teton Valley with that coarse, you know, cobble, gravel that's eroded off the Tetons. And yeah, you can put a ton of water in there and it just disappears. Well, that gives you some idea how much water you could put. Well, that was great. Great